Silas Blackwood had advertised for a sturdy woman. Someone plain and practical, with hands accustomed to work and a spirit that wouldn't break under the Nevada sun. What the Telegraph reply promised was a Miss Lin Yu, arriving on the Tuesday train, prepared for the rigors of frontier life. He stood on the splintered platform of the Promise Creek station, the summer heat pressing down like a physical weight. His golden retriever, Barley, panted at his side, tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm against the wooden planks. Silas had imagined a woman with a sun-weathered face and a simple carpet bag. He had imagined a quiet partnership, built on shared labor and mutual necessity, not affection. The train arrived in a hiss of steam and a screech of metal, a black iron beast panting its way out of the shimmering heat haze. A few drummers and a family of homesteaders disembarked first, swallowed by the small crowd of townsfolk. Then, she appeared in the doorway of the passenger car. She was not what he had imagined. She was small-boned and moved with a deliberate grace that seemed entirely out of place in the dusty, windswept town. Her dress was a dark blue prairie cloth, simple in its cut but impeccably made, a stark contrast to the faded calico of the other women on the platform. Her black hair was coiled in a neat, severe bun, and her face, though composed, held an intelligence that was anything but plain. She descended the steps, her gaze sweeping over the dusty street, the false-fronted buildings, and the curious faces turning to stare. Then her eyes found Silas, holding his gaze with an unnerving steadiness. Behind her, two railroad porters grunted and strained as they wrestled a massive wooden trunk onto the platform. It was made of a dark, reddish wood, bound with brass fittings and covered in carvings of dragons and birds that seemed to writhe in the harsh sunlight. It was a piece of art, a thing of beauty and obvious expense, and it looked as out of place as she did. Barley gave a low, inquisitive whine and trotted forward, his tail wagging. The woman's composure broke for just a moment. A small, genuine smile touched her lips as she knelt, murmuring something in a language Silas didn't understand as she scratched the dog behind his ears. Barley leaned into her touch as if he'd known her his whole life. Silas finally found his feet, his worn boots scuffing on the planks as he approached. The whispers of the townspeople were a low buzz at the edge of his hearing. He was a private man, a man who had built his ranch far from town precisely to avoid this kind of scrutiny. Now, he was the center of it. "Miss Yu?" he asked. His voice was rougher than he intended. She stood, her expression once again reserved. "Mr. Blackwood." "It is an honor." Her English was precise, accented but clear. "The honor is mine," he replied, the words a stiff formality. He tipped his hat, his eyes drawn again to the trunk. It was larger than any travel chest he had ever seen, and it sat on the platform with an air of profound permanence. "This is all your luggage?" "It is all I require," she said. The railroad agent, a harried man named Peterson, hurried over. "Silas, you'll need your wagon for this thing. It weighs a ton." The porters nearly broke their backs on it. Silas nodded, his mind racing. This was not the arrangement he had made. He had sent passage money for a woman and her personal effects, not for a piece of furniture that looked like it belonged in a San Francisco mansion. He had paid for a partner, a helper. This woman, with her quiet dignity and her monumental trunk, felt like a guest, or worse, a liability. But the agreement was made. His word was his bond, and in a place like Promise Creek, a man's word was the only currency that truly mattered. "I have the wagon hitched behind the general store," he said, forcing a practical tone. "We can load it up." The journey back to the ranch was a silent one, save for the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves. Lin Yu sat straight-backed on the bench beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She did not flinch at the bumps or comment on the stark, beautiful desolation of the landscape. She simply watched, her eyes taking in the sagebrush, the distant, heat-scorched mountains, the vast, unforgiving sky. The trunk sat in the wagon bed behind them, a silent, heavy third passenger. Silas could feel its weight, not just in the way the wagon labored up the grades, but in the air between them. Secrets were heavy things, and he was certain that trunk was full of them. He had wanted a simple life, and he had a feeling he had just invited the most complicated thing in the world to come and live in it. Barley lay with his head on the seat between them, his gaze shifting from Silas to Lin Yu, as if trying to bridge the silent gap. When they finally crested the last rise and his small, clapboard ranch house came into view, nestled in a shallow valley by a stand of cottonwoods, Silas felt a pang of something close to shame. It was a lonely place, built by his own two hands. It was sturdy and honest, but it was not beautiful. He wondered what she must think, this woman with her silk-lined trunk, upon seeing his rough-hewn life laid bare. He pulled the wagon to a stop in the dusty yard. "This is it," he said. "This is home." Lin Yu looked at the house, at the corral where his two horses stood swishing their tails, at the endless expanse of land stretching out in every direction. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to him, her expression unreadable. "It is very quiet," she said. Silas wasn't sure if she meant it as a compliment or a complaint. He climbed down from the wagon, his joints stiff from the long ride. "Quiet is what I've got to offer." Getting the trunk inside was a battle. Even with both of them pushing and pulling, it was a near impossible task. It scraped against the doorframe, the sound a deep groan of protest. Finally, it was inside, sitting in the middle of the main room and dominating the small space. It looked like a king's coffin in a pauper's hut. Silas stood, wiping sweat from his brow, breathing heavily. Lin Yu, however, was barely winded. She ran a hand over the carved surface, a strange, protective gesture. That night, Silas gave her the only bedroom and made a bed for himself by the cold hearth. He lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the house settling. He heard no movement from her room. There was only the vast, deep silence of the Nevada night, and the unsettling presence of the woman and her secret-filled trunk, sleeping under his roof. He did not yet know that the trunk was not the only secret she was hiding. The next morning, the sun rose hot and fierce, promising another day of blistering heat. Silas was up before dawn, his routine a comfort in the face of the new uncertainty in his life. He made coffee, his movements loud in the quiet house. He expected her to stay in her room, perhaps overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all. But as he was heading out to the barn, the screen door creaked open behind him. Lin Yu stood there, dressed in a simpler, more practical dress than the one she had traveled in. Her sleeves were already rolled up. "I would like to help," she said. It was not a question. Silas hesitated. "The work is hard." "It's not for..." He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence without causing offense. "Not for a woman like you." "I am aware," she said, her tone level. "Nevertheless, I will help." There was a finality in her voice that left no room for argument. Silas simply nodded and led the way to the northern pasture. The summer drought had been relentless, and a section of the fence line had been weakened by a small flash flood 2 weeks prior. A half-dozen of his cattle had pushed through the gap overnight and were now wandering toward the open range. He expected her to watch from a distance, but she picked up the spare coil of wire and the fencing pliers without a word. She watched him work for a few minutes, her eyes sharp and analytical. He was stretching the wire, fighting the tension, his muscles straining. "Allow me," she said, stepping forward. Before he could protest, she took the wire from him. Instead of trying to pull it taut with brute force, she created a simple but ingenious loop around the post, using the pliers as a lever. With a fraction of the effort he had been using, she cinched the wire tight, tighter than he could have managed himself. She then secured it with a few quick, deft twists. It was a knot he had never seen before, elegant and brutally effective. Silas stared, first at the perfectly tightened wire, then at her. Her hands were steady, her movements precise. There was a competence in them that belied their slender appearance. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice filled with grudging admiration. "My father taught me," she said simply, moving to the next post. He believed knowledge of how things are built, and how they are mended, is a form of wealth that cannot be stolen. They worked together for the rest of the morning, the initial awkwardness slowly replaced by a shared rhythm of labor. She did not speak much, but her presence was a steadying one. She anticipated what he needed before he asked, handing him staples, pulling the wire, her movements efficient and sure. Barley trotted between them, occasionally nudging her hand with his wet nose, a gesture she always returned with a quiet pat. By midday, the fence was mended, stronger than it had been before. The stray cattle were rounded up and driven back into the pasture. As they walked back to the house, covered in dust and sweat, Silas felt a flicker of something new. It wasn't the simple relief of a job done. It was respect. Their quiet accomplishment was shattered by the sound of an approaching rider. Jedediah Finch crested the hill on his big bay gelding, his presence casting a long shadow over the yard. Finch was a man who thrived on the misfortunes of others. He owned the town's only saloon, held half the mortgages in the county, and had been trying to get his hands on Silas's ranch for years, coveting its reliable creek. Finch reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene with a smug, assessing gaze. He looked at Silas, then his eyes landed on Lin Yu, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well now, Blackwood," Finch drawled, his voice thick with condescension. "I heard you'd ordered yourself some exotic company. Didn't figure you for the type." Silas felt a hot surge of anger. He stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Lin Yu. "This is my wife, Mrs. Blackwood. And this is my property. State your business, Finch, or ride on." Finch laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Mrs. Blackwood, is it? Did you find her in a catalogue from the Orient?" He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Lin Yu's feet. "You bring this woman onto your land, Silas, you bring her shame on yourself. Folks in town are already talking. Wondering what kind of man brings a heathen to a decent community." Lin Yu did not flinch. She stood tall, her gaze fixed on Finch, her expression a mask of cold fury. But Silas saw the slight tremor in her hands. The insult was not just to her, it was a direct challenge to him, a public test of his character. Every instinct screamed at him to keep his head down, to avoid trouble. Finch held the note on his eastern pasture, a debt that was a constant weight on his shoulders. Antagonizing him was foolish. But looking at Lin Yu's proud, defiant stillness, and remembering her quiet competence at the fence line, Silas found he could not back down. "What folks in town talk about is their business," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "Who I welcome into my home is mine. You've got no business here, Jedediah. Get off my land." Finch's smile vanished. His eyes hardened. "That note comes due in 3 months, Blackwood. The bank ain't gonna look kindly on a man who associates with her kind. You might find credit a little harder to come by." He gave Lin Yu one last, lingering look of contempt. "You made your bed. Don't come crying to me when you have to lie in it." With a sharp tug on the reins, Finch wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and silent animosity hanging in the air. The immediate threat was gone, but a much larger one now loomed. Finch had made it clear he would use his financial power to ruin them. Silas looked at Lin Yu, the woman he barely knew, and realized her arrival had just put a target on both their backs. That evening, he sat on the porch steps, cleaning his rifle, the familiar motions a small comfort. He watched her through the open door. She was standing before the massive trunk, her back to him. Her hand rested on the carved lid, and she spoke to it in low, soft tones, her voice a murmur of grief and resolve. He did not yet know that Jedediah Finch was at that very moment in the telegraph office, sending a detailed message to a man in Carson City, a message about a Chinese woman, a rancher named Blackwood, and a trunk that looked far too valuable for the Nevada frontier. The confrontation with Finch left a chill in the house that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. Dinner was a silent affair, the clink of forks against plates the only sound. Silas felt the weight of unspoken words pressing down on him. He had defended her, and in doing so, had tied his fate to hers in a way that went far beyond the simple contract of their arrangement. He had made an enemy of a powerful man for a woman who was still a complete stranger. After they had cleared the table, he followed her into the main room, where the great trunk stood like a silent altar. "I'm sorry about Finch," he began, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "He's a difficult man." Lin Yu turned from the trunk to face him. The lamplight cast soft shadows on her face, and for the first time, he saw the deep exhaustion in her eyes. "He is not the first difficult man I have met, Mr. Blackwood. Nor, I fear, will he be the last." "Silas," he corrected her gently. "My name is Silas." A small nod was her only acknowledgement. "You defended my honor, Silas." "You did not have to. It has put you in a dangerous position." "He was on my land," Silas said, falling back on the simple, unshakable logic of a property owner. "And you are my wife." The word felt strange on his tongue, both a lie and a truth. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if searching for something. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. She took a deep breath, a decision solidifying behind her eyes. "I have not been entirely honest with you," she said, her voice low. "I answered your advertisement because it described a life of isolation. A place where a person could disappear. I did not come to America to be a wife. I came here to hide." She knelt before the trunk and produced a small, ornate brass key from a chain around her neck. With a click that echoed in the silent room, she unlocked it. She lifted the heavy lid. Silas had expected gold, or perhaps fine silks. He was not prepared for what he saw. The trunk was not filled with treasure in the way he understood it. It was packed with dozens of objects, each wrapped in yellow silk. She carefully lifted one out and unwrapped it. It was a jade sculpture of a dragon, no bigger than his hand, but carved with such intricate detail that it seemed alive. The stone was the color of the deepest part of a forest lake, cool and luminous in the lamplight. "My family were scholars and artists for generations," she said, her voice thick with a sorrow that was years old. "We served the emperor. But empires change. New men with new ambitions came to power. They coveted my family's position, and our wealth." She unwrapped another object, a set of calligraphy brushes with ivory handles. "They fabricated charges of treason. Soldiers came in the night. My father and brothers, they fought to give my mother and me time to escape." She paused, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the smooth, cool jade. "My mother died on the ship to California. Before she did, she made me promise to preserve these. This is all that is left of my family. It is not a fortune to be spent. It is a history to be protected. The men who destroyed my family believe this trunk contains proof of their crimes. They have been hunting me ever since I landed." The truth of it hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. The trunk was not a treasure chest, it was a burden. A dangerous, beautiful burden. And Jedediah Finch, with his greedy eyes and loose tongue, had just announced its location to the world. "These men," Silas asked, his voice tight. "Do you think they will come here?" "They will," she said with chilling certainty. "A man like Mr. Finch cannot keep a secret, especially one he thinks will bring him profit. He will tell someone, who will tell someone else. The word will travel." Her words were prophetic. 2 days later, they came. They did not ride up loudly like Finch. They appeared at dusk, 2 men on horseback, materializing out of the purple twilight as if from the earth itself. They were not dusty cowboys or local thugs. They wore dark city suits, their clothes clean despite the trail, and they moved with a quiet, predatory confidence. Barley, who had been dozing on the porch, rose to his feet, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his chest. Silas was on the porch, mending a piece of tack. He saw them and his hand went still. Lin Yu appeared in the doorway behind him, her face pale but her posture rigid. The lead rider, a man with a thin mustache and cold, dead eyes, dismounted smoothly. "Silas Blackwood?" he asked. His voice was polite, which made it all the more menacing. "I am," Silas said, standing slowly. "My name is Mr. Kwon." "We have a warrant from the territorial court in Carson City," the man said, producing a folded document from his coat pocket. "It is for the arrest of a fugitive, Lin Yu, and the seizure of property stolen from the estate of Governor Chen." He held out the paper. Silas didn't take it. He knew, with absolute certainty, that it was a forgery. The law didn't move that fast out here, and these men did not feel like officers of any court. They felt like wolves. "There's no fugitive here," Silas said, his voice steady. He moved to block the doorway, shielding Lin Yu from their view. "Only my wife." "You've made a mistake." Mr. Kwon smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "There is no mistake. We know she is here. And we know what she has in that trunk. Give her to us, Mr. Blackwood, and we will be on our way. You can go back to your quiet life. Resist, and we will be forced to consider you an accomplice." This was the choice. The one that mattered. He could step aside. He could hand over this woman and her cursed trunk and be free of it all. Finch would get his land, the town would forget, and his life would go back to being simple and quiet. Or he could stand his ground. He could fight for this stranger, this woman of secrets and sorrows, and in doing so, make himself a target for men who dealt in violence as casually as he dealt in cattle. He looked over his shoulder at Lin Yu. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw not fear, but a fiery, unyielding defiance. She would not be taken easily. She would fight, even if it was hopeless. In that moment, something shifted inside him. He was a simple man, but he was not a coward. "I reckon you're the ones who've made a mistake," Silas said, letting his hand drop to the handle of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. "This is my home. And you are not welcome in it. I suggest you get back on your horses and ride away." Mr. Kwon's polite facade dropped. His eyes went flat and hard. "A foolish choice, rancher." His hand moved toward his own coat, but before he could draw his weapon, Silas acted. He wasn't a gunfighter, but he was a man of the frontier, and his reflexes were honed by a life of reacting to sudden dangers. He kicked over the heavy wooden bench on the porch. It crashed to the ground with a loud bang that startled the horses. In that split second of confusion, he drew his pistol. "Now," he yelled to Lin Yu. She didn't hesitate. She slammed the heavy oak door shut and threw the crossbar, the sound of the thick wood sliding into its iron brackets a deafening boom in the sudden quiet. A gunshot splintered the wood of the doorframe an instant later. Silas dove behind the stone foundation of the porch, firing a shot into the dust near the men's feet, not to hit them, but to drive them back. Barley barked furiously, a frantic, protective rage. The second man was already firing, his bullets chewing up the porch railings. Silas knew they were trapped. It was 2 against 1, and they were pinned down. But as another bullet slammed into the wall near the window, the glass shattered, and he saw Lin Yu's arm snake out. In her hand was one of the heavy jade sculptures from the trunk. With a strength he wouldn't have thought she possessed, she hurled it. The dragon, a priceless work of art, flew through the air and struck the second gunman squarely in the side of the head. He grunted and collapsed, dropping his pistol. Mr. Kwon, shocked by the sudden turn of events, fired wildly toward the window. Silas used the opening. He rose from behind the foundation and fired one careful, deliberate shot. The bullet struck Kwon in the shoulder, spinning him around. The man cried out in pain, clutching his arm, his gun falling into the dirt. He stared at Silas with pure hatred, then scrambled for his fallen partner, dragged him onto his horse, and fled into the darkness, leaving a trail of curses behind them. Silence descended, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing and Barley's low whining. The immediate danger was over. But they both knew it was only a reprieve. The men would be back, and they would not come alone. 6 months later, the first snows of winter were dusting the high peaks of the Sierras. The chill in the air was clean and sharp, a welcome change from the oppressive heat of the summer. In the yard of Silas Blackwood's ranch, things were different. A new, sturdy-looking barn stood where an old, leaning shed had been. The corral held a dozen more head of cattle than it had before, and the clapboard house had a fresh coat of whitewash. Inside, the great wooden trunk still sat in the main room, but it was no longer a symbol of fear and secrets. Its lid was open, and several of the silk-wrapped objects were displayed on the mantelpiece, their beauty catching the morning light. They had sold one of the smaller jade pieces to a discreet collector in San Francisco, a man a lawyer in Carson City had found for them. The transaction had been complex and dangerous, but the money it brought had changed everything. The first thing Silas did was ride into Promise Creek and walk into Jedediah Finch Saloon. He slapped the full amount of the mortgage payment down on the bar in gold coin, the sound ringing through the suddenly silent room. Finch's face turned a mottled shade of red, but he could do nothing. The debt was paid. His leverage was gone. The rest of the money had gone to the lawyer, a shrewd, tenacious man who was now fighting a legal battle on Lin Yu's behalf, challenging the fraudulent warrants and exposing the corruption of the men who had destroyed her family. Word had come by telegraph the week before that Governor Chen himself was now under investigation. The men who had come to the ranch would not be returning. The ranch was thriving. With the financial burden lifted, and with Lin Yu's sharp mind for planning, they had made it more profitable in a few months than Silas had managed in 10 years on his own. She had a gift for seeing patterns, for knowing when to sell and when to hold, for understanding the subtle shifts of the market. Her father had taught her more than just knots. That evening, they sat together on the porch steps, a shared blanket across their laps, watching the alpenglow paint the mountains in shades of rose and violet. Barley lay at their feet, his head resting on Silas's boot. The silence between them was no longer awkward or heavy. It was a comfortable, easy quiet, born of shared struggle and deep, unspoken understanding. "My lawyer says we have a strong case," Lin Yu said, her voice soft. "He believes my family's name will be cleared. Our lands and titles may even be restored." Silas looked at her. "Would you go back?" he asked, the question costing him more than he wanted to admit. She was quiet for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky. "What was taken from me can never be truly restored," she said finally. "My home is gone." It was not the land or the house. It was the people. She turned to look at him, her eyes clear and steady in the gathering dusk. "I have found a new home here, Silas. If you will have me." He didn't have to think about his answer. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were slender, but her grip was strong, the hand of a woman who knew how to mend a fence and build a life. He had sent for a sturdy, plain wife to help him survive. Instead, he had found a brilliant, courageous partner who had taught him how to truly live. He had not gotten the wife he advertised for. He had gotten the one he needed. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.